Okay, I think it's time to start. So let's begin this second session where we'll be looking at this view of emptiness. In this session, we'll begin with a meditation of, first one will be no self, looking for the self. Then we'll follow that with a review of some of the main points from the previous session. Then we'll briefly discuss what do we mean by no self before we introduce this view of emptiness. And with respect to that, what we mean by labeling. And then we'll do a meditation, an emptiness meditation focused on the body, and then time for some question answer at the end of the session. With the meditation on no self, we'll be following the same process as with impermanence in the earlier session. That means we'll use the classic approach of the 4 applications of mindfulness. That is, we are applying mindfulness to the body, to feelings, to mind, phenomena, to come to an insight into no self, to investigate the body, and feelings will include in the mind in this meditation. We'll investigate the body. Is there a self to be found in the body? Is there a self to be found in the mind? And then phenomena in the third part of the meditation, is there a self to be seen anywhere? Because we have instinctively this sense of an autonomous self, a me that seems to be somewhere here, that seems to be something more than just the body and the mind, something extra. We sort of say, I have a body, I have a mind, as if there's 3 things here. There's a me, the body, and the mind. That sense of autonomous me. Is there such a autonomous self to be found anywhere here? That's what we're going to do in this meditation. So let's do that meditation now. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Vigilant postures to keep the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. and allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in stillness. And now we can begin Vipassana practice, applying mindfulness to gain an insight into no self. And first, we'll apply mindfulness to the body, investigating the body on the basis of the question, is there a self to be seen anywhere within the body? So simply observe the body. And is there a self to be seen anywhere there? Observing the tactile sensations within the body. Is there a self anywhere within the field of the body? Look closely. And now we can apply mindfulness to the mind. Investigate the mind. Observe the mind on the basis of the question, is there a self to be seen anywhere within the mind? Look closely. And then we can apply mindfulness to phenomena. That is, whatever is appearing, is there a self to be seen? A self that seems to be more than the body, a self that seems to be something more than the mind. Is there a self to be seen anywhere in any appearances? Look closely. Or is all that is seen body and mind? Look closely. Is there a self there? We can bring the meditation to a close. Let's start with a short review. And so in today's sessions, we're looking at the cognitive balance. And to achieve cognitive balance within Buddhist perspective, we're talking about engaging in the Vipassana practice or the insight practice, the practice of applying the mindfulness that we've cultivated in shamatha, applying that mindfulness to gain insights into nature of reality. And here, in terms of cognitive dysfunction or distorted views, there are four that we are looking at. Seeing things which are changing as unchanging. We overcome that cognitive dysfunction by gaining an insight into impermanence. Seeing pleasure as happiness. We overcome that by gaining this insight into suffering that we briefly mentioned in the last session. And then the cognitive dysfunction of grasping to self where there is no self, we overcome that with an insight into no self. And we'll talk about this idea of self a little bit more detail shortly. And then lastly, the main topic for this session is the cognitive dysfunction or distorted view of grasping things which are dependent as independent. And we overcome that through the insight into emptiness. And so we saw there that in terms of Vipassana practice in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, we're applying mindfulness to these four elements of the body, the feelings, mind, phenomena, to gain these insights into impermanence, suffering, and no self. And in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, based on the Sanskrit texts, the Vipassana practice is not only these three marks of existence, but at the deepest level, the insight into emptiness. So generally in the Theravada traditions, when they say they're doing Vipassana practice, they're talking about gaining these insights into the three marks of existence. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, when they say they're doing Vipassana practice, generally they're talking about the practice of emptiness, the wisdom of emptiness. What are the benefits of the Vipassana practice of impermanence? We saw there that if we can gain that insight, then we can be more in harmony with the flow of life rather than fighting against it, reduce attachment thereby, and have more enjoyment of simple pleasures in life. But at a deeper level, an insight into impermanence will set us up well to give us a good basis for an insight into suffering and an insight into no self as well. And we saw there that the benefits in the last session of the Vipassana practice of suffering is that by gaining an insight into suffering or dukkha, that will help to reduce craving and attachment, understanding to simple pleasures, understanding that they're not in the nature of happiness. At a deeper level, then that will lead us to develop a wish to be free, to be liberated from suffering, understanding actually what suffering is and that the source of suffering lies within our own mind. And that will also help us to lead it to compassion, to develop compassion for others, understanding everyone else is also stuck in the same situation as ourselves. And then a little bit more about this idea of no self before we go on to the topic of emptiness. When we see the word self, we have to be very careful when we use that word or hear that word, because it can mean a number of different things depending on context. Sometimes when the word self is used, it just means person, as in myself. And so then self exists, we exist, person exists. But generally in the context of Vipassana practice, when we use the word or see the word self, it's talking about an overinflated false sense of me, not just the idea of me, self versus others. One way there's a false sense of self is a self that is unchanging, unitary, meaning a single thing, and completely independent of everything else. That's something that we don't instinctively have, that false sense of self, but it could be something we develop through some wrong intellectual way of thinking. Whereas the one we were really meditating on just now is the sense of an autonomous self. There seems to be a me here somewhere that seems to be something a little bit more than just the body and the mind. There seems to be three things here. There's me, body, and mind. Because I say, I have a body, I have a mind, as if there's a third thing, a me, that has a body and has a mind. And we do have instinctively this sense of self, autonomous self. A me here seems to be something more than the body and the mind. That's what we were looking for in the last meditation. Is there such a self to be seen anywhere here within the body and the mind? At a deeper level, we can also talk about an inherently existent self or person, meaning a person that's findable, be able to point and say, there it is. That's what we're going to be looking at in the next meditation in the context of this wisdom of emptiness. So emptiness, this wisdom of emptiness is saying there is no inherently existent person. There is no person existing from their own side. And we'll look at what that really means shortly. Now, the benefits of this Vipassana practice of no self, no autonomous self, that will help to reduce and eliminate mental afflictions, because mental afflictions come out of this false sense of self. And if we can really eliminate this false sense of self, then we can also reduce and eliminate all suffering, and we can achieve liberation from suffering. Because here in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, the root cause of why we're stuck in suffering is grasping to this autonomous self. If we can realize there's no autonomous self, we can overcome all mental afflictions and suffering, achieve liberation from suffering. This is usually described using the word nirvana. But let's now look at this wisdom of emptiness, the view of emptiness. In the Four Noble Truths teachings, the fundamental ignorance is this grasping to self. So how we see ourselves as a person, this is the core problem. That's what we need to fix to overcome our mental afflictions and sufferings. Whereas in the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, the Buddha went a bit further and he said, well, actually also how we see the world is a problem. There is no independent objective world out there, no independent subjective me here. Nothing exists independently. And that's often described in the text using a number of different terms. One term used a lot is the word inherent existence. And that has the idea of things being self-existent, that the world is made up of many separate, discrete things, each one having its own unique identity of being that thing. Another term commonly used to describe independent existence, things existing from their own side. That has the idea that things exist there without the need of an observer. They already exist, and we simply come along and confirm their existence. True existence. Things appear to exist independent of us, and if that's actually how they existed, they would be true, meaning the way in which they exist, the way in which they appear, and the way in which they exist matches. So true existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. These are three terms used to describe the same thing, independent existence. Here in these Perfection of Wisdom teachings, the assertion is that things do not exist independently. Why? Because they exist dependently. And that's described using the following reasoning, is that things are empty of inherent existence. In other words, things are not independently existent because they are dependent arisings. Dependent arising means coming into existence dependently. So that's the reasoning. Things are empty of inherent existence because they are dependent arisings. This phrase here, empty of inherent existence, that's emptiness. Emptiness in Sanskrit is shunyata. Shunyata, shunya literally means zero, hollow, or empty. Ta means ness, so it means like hollowness, emptiness, zeroness, meaning there's no core to anything, meaning nothing has a unique identity as that thing. Nothing has an essence of being that thing from its own side. So let's have a look at now, what does it mean? If we understand how things exist dependently, that will help us better understand how they're not independent, i.e. emptiness. So how do things come into existence dependently? Things come into existence dependently in three ways. Through causes and conditions. For example, if we use the example of a sprout, causes and conditions, cause or substantial cause is the thing that transforms into the result. So the underlying cause of the plant or sprout is the seed. But for that seed to transform into the sprout, we need lots of other conditions. We need soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. Those causes and conditions together will help lead to a sprout or plant coming into existence. Parts, but the plant also exists depending on its parts. To have a plant, we need the roots, stem, branches, and leaves. Straightforward. So I think both causes and conditions and parts are straightforward. But I think we're quite happy to accept that a plant exists depending on causes and conditions, and a plant exists depending on its parts, yet at the same time to say there is a plant existing there objectively, independent of us. But that's contradiction. Either a plant is dependent or it's independent. It can't be both. So why is it that we seem to be able to accept causes and conditions and parts, and at the same time accept the idea that things exist there objectively from their own side? That's because we don't understand them at the deepest level. To understand causes and conditions and parts at deepest level, we have to go to the third way of understanding how things are dependent. That is, things exist depending on labeling. Another word for labeling is imputation, designation, conception. And then when we see the word labeling, we think, yeah, I know what that means. It means there's a thing over there and I'm calling it a plant or a sprout. Again, that's a very superficial understanding of labeling. Let's have a look at what labeling really means. When we look out on the world, we just receive a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. To make sense or meaning out of this data, then what we have to do, because if we don't make sense or meaning out of it, we can't function. So what we do is we draw lines around various collections of data and create meaningful objects to make sense or meaning out of what we perceive. But we need to do more than that, because we're living in a world with others. In order to communicate with others, we have to give a name to the things that we've created. So labeling is this process of drawing a line, creating a meaningful object, and then giving it a name. How we do that is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get out of what we perceive. For example, here, this diagram we see in this slide, how many things are there? How many things? Most commonly, we would probably draw one line around all of that data, create one object and call it a star. On another occasion, it may be more meaningful to draw two lines, create two objects, and say there's two triangles there. On another occasion, it may be more meaningful to draw 6 lines and say there's 6 triangles there. Another occasion, draw 7 lines and say there's 6 triangles and a hexagon. On another occasion, it may be more meaningful to say there's a collection of 18 lines there. So is there 1, 2, 6, 7, 18 objects there? How many things are there? We decide. We decide how many things are there. So therefore, we end up with 2 terms that are commonly used here. Things are merely labeled, meaning things only exist within our conceptual framework. That the star, there is no star there. The only star that exists is the one we've created in our conceptual mind. So similarly, therefore, things are not findable. You cannot find a star there in the basis, a star from its own side, because there's no star to be found there objectively in the basis. Again, the star only exists within our conceptual framework. Based on this understanding of labeling, of drawing lines, creating objects, giving a name, let's go back now and briefly look at cause and conditions and parts again, and to see if we can understand them a little bit more deeper understanding. So here we have in this diagram a timeline, the seed creating the plant. So the seed is the cause of the plant, and then the conditions of soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. Now, we believe that things exist objectively. If things exist objectively independent of us, it should be a fixed, obvious point where the seed becomes the plant. So at what point in this process does the seed become the plant? And by looking at this, we can understand that the point at where the seed becomes the plant is the point at where this configuration of data here stops resembling our concept of seed and starts resembling our concept of plant. And each one of us has slightly different concepts of what it means to be a seed and what it means to be a plant. So for some of us, that point where the seed becomes a plant is already way back here at the beginning. Some of us more in the middle, some of us maybe more towards the end. We decide when the plant comes into existence. Now, if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, by definition, they cannot exist at the same time. So here's the question. Does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? So again, think about it closely. Does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? There can only be 2 answers, yes or no. Which is it? Most commonly, people say no. If we say no, that would mean the seed and the plant exist at the same time. That's illogical. So no is illogical. If we say yes, the seed has ceased to exist before the plant comes into existence, then the seed has ceased to exist. Where is the plant coming from? Yes is illogical. What we can see from that is that our common sense idea of causality, based on things existing objectively independent of us, becomes illogical. It can't function. It's impossible. Also here, we say that the plant exists depending on cause and conditions. In other words, the plant exists depending on the seed. But this view of emptiness is also saying the seed exists depending on the plant. How does the seed exist depending on the plant or the sprout? And it's not because the sprout produces more seeds. That's not the answer. The answer is that we can only call something a seed if we have the idea plant. We can only call something a cause if we have the idea result. Whether or not that exists is irrelevant. So also seed depends on plant. So this is a little bit better understanding of causes and conditions based on the idea of labeling, of emptiness as well. What about parts? We use the example of the pen here. The pen exists depending on its parts, but can you find the pen here? Is the pen findable in the bases? If we search there in the bases, can you find the pen? So if we pull apart the pen into the parts, then is this part a pen? No, that's a cap. That's a tube. That's the end point. There's a round metal ball, a plastic bit, a plastic tube, ink. None of these parts is a pen. So where is the pen? And then people say, oh, that's easy. It's the collection of those parts. Well, here on the right, we have the collection. There's a pen. Oh, no, it has to be in a certain shape. So when does the pen come into existence? The pen comes into existence when this configuration of data closely enough resembles our concept of pen. And our concepts have at least two parts, appearance and functionality. So when this appears closely enough to resemble our concept of pen and seems to function according to our idea of pen, then there's a pen. There is no pen to be found there objectively in the basis. Because if there was a pen existing there objectively, if a caveman came along here, they would pick it up and start writing with it. But maybe a caveman would see a weapon to stab with. And then also, if a dog came along here, the dog may see some sort of chewing stick, something to chew on. And then if an ant, tiny ant came here, they maybe see some sort of home to live in. So is this a pen, a weapon, a chewing stick, or a home? From its own side, none of those things. From the side of the observer, all of those things. So similarly here, we say that the pen exists depending on its parts. But also the part depends on the whole, because we can only call something part of a pen if we have the idea pen. So therefore, this is a better understanding of parts based on the idea of labeling. And so what we're going to do now then is we're going to do a meditation where we investigate the body. So we'll start again with the body and we'll look to see, is there a body to be found here objectively or not within the various parts? And we'll look at that, but then we'll also, and that's to come to an insight into emptiness, but also in the same meditation, we will then look at how does the body exist as a dependent arising. So let's do that meditation now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. We begin by preparing the body. Setting up a good posture, back straight, and body relaxed. Using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And having established a good posture, then keeping the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And preparing the mind, setting into a state of ease and relaxation, releasing all activities of the mind, and simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Let's begin the Vipassana practice, applying mindfulness to the body, to investigate the body, to come to see how does the body exist. When you say my body, how does the body appear to exist to your mind? Does it appear to be a single thing existing from its own side, completely independent of everything else? If the body exists from its own side, then it should be findable. Can you find the body objectively? Is there a body there objectively? When we try to point to the body, where do we usually point? Usually we point to the area of the chest. So is there anything there in the chest that is objectively a body? Look closely. Is there anything in the head that is objectively a body from its own side? What about in the arms or the legs? Is there anything there that is a body objectively? No matter where we look, we just see parts of a body. Is the body then simply the collection of these parts? Each part is not a body. Hence, the collection of these parts is a collection of things, none of which is a body. Where is there a body to be found objectively within a collection of things, none of which is a body? Yet, other than these parts, what body is there? If you can't find the body, simply rest in the experience of not finding. Even if you didn't find the body, it's undeniable that there is a body. The body exists. But how can the body exist if we don't seem to be able to find it? The body exists through depending on other factors. The body exists depending on causes and conditions, such as the food we eat and all the bodily processes that are going on. Other than merely this continuous unfolding of causes and conditions, what body is there? And the body exists depending on the parts, such as the head, chest, arms, and legs. Other than merely these parts, what body is there? And the body exists simply as being merely labeled upon these parts. Other than being merely labeled, what body is there? In the Heart Sutra, it says, form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form also is not other than emptiness. Or in other words, what it's saying is the body is empty. Emptiness is the body. Emptiness is not other than the body. The body also is not other than emptiness. In other words, emptiness and dependent arising are like two sides of a coin. Emptiness means dependent arising. Dependent arising means emptiness. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So now we have plenty of time for questions. So if there's any questions, then you can either put them in the chat, or if you prefer, you can ask them directly via video.
We have one question from Anat.
Sure.
If there is no self, who observes the mind? And can something exist without being seen?
Right. The first part of the question is, we have to be careful when we use the word self. Here in the context of Vipassana practice, when we see the word self, we're talking about an overinflated false sense of me. We're not simply talking about me, the person. There is no Buddhist tradition that says we don't exist or you don't exist. People exist. It's a question of how we exist. That's what we're trying to clarify here in Vipassana practice. Because if you didn't exist, you couldn't ask the question. So the fact that you can ask the question means you exist. Self then here, now we're talking in emptiness. Well, let's go back to the autonomous self. So when we use the word self, a self that doesn't exist is a self that is something more than the body and the mind. And we have that false sense of self. We often think that there's a me here that has a body, has a mind. It's sort of a me that's trying to control this body and mind, as if there's a third thing. There's me, a body, and a mind. The idea of an autonomous self. That self, the autonomous self, doesn't exist. That's what we were meditating on before. So that's a self that is something more than the body and the mind. Here, in the context of emptiness, we're going one level deeper. Even at a deeper level, so it's not that difficult to realize the self or the me is not something more in addition to the body and the mind. What we do grasp at a very subtle level is that this is me. The body and the mind is me. The me is simply the body and the mind. That's a me, a self that is existing from its own side, existing objectively, existing inherently. That's what we're overcoming here in this view of emptiness. That if we look in the body, we look in the mind, is there a me here somewhere? Is the me the body and the mind, simply the body and the mind? And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail next session. But here, so self again, so there is a me. There's self in terms of myself. We exist. We are doing the meditation. We're observing and so forth. But again, we do not exist in this overinflated way, as either as an autonomous self, as something more than the body and the mind, or an inherently existent self that is the body and the mind. That we are overcoming. And then there was a second part of the question. What was the second part again?
Can something exist without being seen?
Can something exist without being seen? There are plenty of things that exist that we don't know about. But just because we can't see it doesn't mean somehow then it exists objectively. We're talking about how things exist, and things only exist within our conceptual framework. But I could go into, well, okay. So the Higgs boson, did that exist before they discovered it, or before it was postulated?
What is it?
The Higgs boson, that, you know, that God, they called it the God particle, the very subtle particle that they discovered in the Hadron Collider in CERN some years ago. Well, actually, they didn't discover it. They ran some experiments that would below a certain level of error, conclusively would show that it would exist. So they didn't actually see it, but the results of the experiment and the level of error that's allowed meant that they fairly conclusive that this Higgs boson exists. But again, what's a Higgs boson? Isn't a Higgs boson a concept that we've developed to try to explain all of this? I mean, isn't a cup a concept that we've developed to help us to make sense of things? So this is the real challenge here in this emptiness, is that we are really sort of stuck in what's called the two extremes. In that now, and we'll talk about this more in the next session, is that now there only seems to be two possibilities for us. Either there is a real me here, a real objective world there, or there's no me and no world. Because that's the only me and the only world that seems to exist is the one that seems to appear to us. The world appears to exist out there independent of us. And the me appears to exist completely independent of everything else. We've never seen the world and me in any other way. And so if we negate that, it seems like, well, then there can be no me and no world. And we sort of end up in this extreme of nihilism. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session. Okay, any more questions?
We have a question or a saying, shaking and shocking at the same time. I do realize and understand the dependent existing, as well observing the mind, not thinking but being in emptiness. Did not really understand. I don't know if it's a
So
question.
the question is that they understand dependency but not emptiness. Is that sort of the question?
Yes.
Okay.
How to be in emptiness. Wait, maybe.
Correct. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. I think for many of us, dependency is a little bit easier to understand, at least at sort of a surface level, because dependency, you know, we can see the interdependency of everything in the world in terms of climate change and everything. So, you know, certainly in terms of causes, conditions, parts, and interdependency, then you know we can appreciate that at a certain level, the dependency. But to understand dependency really at the deepest level, then that really implies an understanding of emptiness, because we can sort of have the idea of dependency, you know, like two things are dependent. We have like, well, there's one thing here, and they're dependent. There somehow is a link between them, you know, that they're interdependent. So that's sort of a little bit the idea we often have. Thing A, thing B, they're related, they're dependent on each other. Whereas actually the understanding, the deepest understanding of dependency is that because of the relationship, you can have the two things can exist. For example, you know, if we have like, let's say big and small, they're related. But you can't have big and small and they're somehow connected. The relationship of size creates big and small. So that's really the deepest understanding of dependency, which then means actually nothing exists objectively. Everything is perspective, you could say, in a certain way of saying. And so that is really the measure of understanding not only dependency, but also understanding emptiness, is that they're like two sides of a coin. And I think it comes up in the next session, is functioning world means emptiness. And because of emptiness, there can be a functioning world. Because if this pen had a unique nature of being a pen, if it was a pen from its own side, objectively, if it had a unique nature of being a pen, then it couldn't change. You couldn't create it, you couldn't destroy it, it couldn't function. But because it has no unique nature from its own side of being a pen, therefore you can create it, you can destroy it, it can function. So functionality means emptiness. Emptiness means functionality. And when we hear the word emptiness, or in Sanskrit shunyata, emptiness doesn't mean nothing really exists. When we hear the word emptiness, we need to ask, empty of what? We're not saying things are empty of existence, that things don't exist. We're saying emptiness is empty of independent existence. Things are not independently existent. They do not exist from their own side. They do not exist objectively. And so again, this is really the measure of understanding both dependency or dependent arising and emptiness, is that because things are empty, therefore things can appear and function. And because things function, they must be empty of independent existence. This is really a correct understanding of emptiness and dependent arising. Takes some time to get there, but that's the measure. Any more questions? Any further questions?
We have a question. I feel like it's difficult to look closely for the self in the body or the mind when I intellectually know that it's merely labeled. How do you suggest overcoming that?
Yes. That's also something I'm going to mention in the next session, is that one of the difficulties in not only this Vipassana meditation, but in other Vipassana meditations, such as impermanence and so forth, is that our intellectual mind gets in the way. You know, we are to look to see, is there a me here to be found? But then when we start the meditation, the intellectual mind comes in and goes, I know the answer. The me is merely labeled. You don't need to look. But remember, Vipassana is about experiential insight. It's not about intellectual understanding. And as with impermanence, I think we all have intellectual understanding of impermanence. And many of us who've studied a bit of Buddhism probably have some intellectual understanding that the me is something merely labeled on the body and the mind. But that intellectual understanding is not doing much for us. It really doesn't change our life, because our behavior is not driven by our intellectual understanding. Our behavior is driven by our instinctive habits. And our instinctive habits in daily life is not that the me is merely labeled. When we're getting angry at someone, the me that's getting angry, we're not seeing the me as something merely labeled on the body and the mind. I can guarantee you that. So what we need to do is to overcome the false instinctive grasping to an independent me. And we can only do that by bringing intellectual understanding into experience. So when we do these Vipassana practices, then give the intellectual mind a holiday, and then just do the practice as described. Just look to see if you can find that me there. And so that we can come to an experiential insight that the me is not findable. That then will really start to change our mind. It will start to change the way we instinctively see ourselves. So leave the intellectual mind out. Otherwise, if we don't, it's like a scientist who's running an experiment. An empirical scientist needs to leave out his belief systems. They may or may not be correct or accurate, but that's of no relevance when we're running an experiment. What we want to do is to see what is the reality. Is the reality matching our idea, or is our idea completely wrong? So let's look empirically. And so therefore in Vipassana practice, give the intellectual mind a holiday and just look. Again, by looking, we're applying mindfulness. If we haven't done shamatha practice, if we haven't done attentional balance training, and we haven't cultivated mindfulness and made it more strong, then it's going to be difficult to apply mindfulness. It's going to be difficult to look closely because our mind is not calm, not clear, not focused. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, without some attentional balance training, without shamatha training, this Vipassana practice is going to be extremely difficult. And probably more likely than the intellectual mind will come in when you're not really being able to look very closely. The intellectual mind goes, oh, you don't need to look because I know the answer. And then we're not doing the practice. So that's what I can recommend. We've got time for a couple more questions if there are.
We have a question written in Hebrew. I'll try to translate.
Sure.
What are the consequences of this perception about death? How does it? How do we think of death through that? And by that, she tries to see what becomes of the self, to what it becomes, if it's not part of self-inherent existence.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to look at, in the next session, again, the idea of self. If there's no self, then what is it that sort of goes on? I mean, if we have some sort of belief in something after this life, what is it that what is it if there's no self? We have a sense there's a me moving through this life, but if there's no self, who moves through this life? And then who moves through death and on to future lives? Who is that if there's no self? We're going to answer that question in the next session. But on death, certainly in the preliminary practices, we're going back to 2 weeks ago, one of the preliminary practices is to reflect on death. And the purpose for that is to become familiar with death so that it's not some sort of unknown, fearful thing. And particularly with this view of mind and emptiness that we're going to continue to look at in the next session, we'll understand that death is simply a transition. And then that we have now a wonderful life, precious life full of opportunities. And by reflecting on death, we'll understand that this opportunity is not going to last forever. So let's take advantage of it while we've got it, so we can make this life meaningful, so that we can better transition through death and end up in a better place in the next life. And so this can really inspire us. Reflecting on death can really inspire us in this way, particularly if we've reflected on the fact of the continuity of mind. And that's something we'll also look at in the next session, and understand that it's just a transition through to another existence. So this is what we can get out of death, and I'll answer the other part of the question in the next session.
Thanks. I think she's asking as well if there's a part in us that is not inherent dependent arising.
Not dependent. Yeah. Well, if it's part of us, then it's dependent, isn't it? I mean, a part of anything, by saying it's a part, it's dependent on the whole, because you can only be called a part of something if you have the whole. So parts, by definition, are dependent, because they also have parts and they're part of something else. And so in that way, they are dependent on their parts and they're also part of something else. So they're dependent on the whole. So everything then is dependent in that sense, if we're talking about parts.
Yes, for me, it sends me into like a bit of nihilism sometimes, because it's also freeing. Like if you see all the parts, and it's in a way like what you said about the two extremes. It's also very freeing, making you free, but also like, so if all of it is like small, really particles, so what am I? Or it's like you feel helpless or nothingness. Or
Sure. And again, we'll look at this in the next session. It's because we're stuck in these two extremes of existence and non-existence, is that when we investigate and find the self or whatever we're looking for, we don't find, then what we tend to do is we fall into the extreme of nihilism, thinking that, well, nothing really exists then. But that's why, if we continue to study and meditate on emptiness, then we'll really appreciate and experience that not finding me doesn't mean no me. It means dependent me. And that is completely liberating, because what we'll realize is the me that I've mistakenly believed in my entire life, this supposed independent me that's caused me so much mental afflictions and suffering, simply doesn't exist. And so we'll have a lot of joy. And so what it's often said is that if we don't have a good appreciation of the view of emptiness and dependent arising, then when we start this meditation, a lot of fear can arise, this existential fear, thinking I'm going out of existence. But as we continue to study and meditate, that fear will turn into joy. Joy, realizing that not only do we exist, but the me that I've falsely believed in, that's the cause of all of my suffering, it just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. And so we'll have a lot of joy that we'll be able to let go of that false idea of self, overcome all of our mental afflictions and suffering. So this is what will happen as we continue to study and meditate on emptiness, is any existential fear that may arise, and that's quite common initially, will transform into joy. Okay. I think that's it. We've run out of time there. So let's take a break again for 30 minutes. And in the next session, we'll look a little bit more about this view of emptiness in terms of middle way and extremes. And then we'll also look at nature of mind in terms of emptiness. We've just briefly looked at person, but also we can in the body. And in the next session, we're going to look for the person, but also we're going to look for the mind. Okay, so but let's take a break. We'll come back in 30 minutes.